Hi, all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I figured it was time to get to the second of the big serial killers here in Oregon. So let's get started, shall we? Randall, or Randy Brent Woodfield, was born on December 26, 1950, to parents Donna, Jean, and Walter Jack Woodfield in Salem, Oregon. Randy had two older sisters, Susan and Nancy. Jack worked for the Pacific Northwest Bell, a telephone company, and by all accounts the family was a typical middle-class family. There are no reports of abuse, and it sounds as if the parents were loving and doting on the entire family. When Randy was 1, the family moved to Corvallis, where they lived for another 2 or 3 years. Then Jack received a promotion that required a move, and so the family moved to Otter Rock, Oregon. And now I've never heard of Otter Rock, but I looked into it, and it looks to be an unincorporated community in Lincoln City. At this time, reports I could find paint a picture of Randy acting as a good kid, but according to him, he slowly began festering this hatred toward women. One that grew because he was surrounded more around women, owing to his mother and sisters that would tell him what to do, rather than Jack, who was the worker of the family. It left Donna Jean to be the disciplinarian. As Randy grew, Donna Jean took a job at the gas station, and with that, Randy had a babysitter. But as his sisters were older, they did not, and he balked against that. He didn't seem to comprehend that it was only since his sisters were older that they had more freedom. Instead, he saw it as a guy versus girl situation. At this time, though, it doesn't sound as if anything serious happened, or at least anything he got caught for. Instead, he was a typical guy. He competed in sports and was good in every one he tried, including track, basketball, and especially football. He was noted to be a star player and held awards in many areas. His parents even created books of his accomplishments, putting together 3 in total during his school years. In junior high, he started exposing himself. He would go to Newport and expose himself often to multiple women a day. Eventually, though, he was recognized. It is a small town after all. But police knew him, again, small town, as a star football player, one with potential to go much further than junior high or high school. And so, his crime was whitewashed. How many times have we heard this? Essentially, everything was just ignored. The rest of school, from junior high and high school, was unremarkable, really. He dated, but a high school friend, Mike Schaefer, said that Randy wasn't a, quote, kiss and tell, end quote, dater. That he would date some of the popular girls, but never more for than a few months. He was part of the German club and made Boy of the Month in the Rotary Club. Randy grew to a stout teenager at about 6'2" and 175 pounds. By the time he was a junior, he made the all-star first team in football, doing it again as a senior, both in which he played wide receiver. He received an honorable mention in all-state basketball as a senior. He also played baseball and was a sprinter on the track team. He graduated from Newport High School in 1981. According to Randy, he was recruited by every college in the Pacific Northwest. The summer after he graduated high school, Randy worked at the same company as his father, driving trucks as well as cleaning and repairing telephone booths. Then, in the fall, he enrolled in Treasure Valley Community College in Ontario, Oregon. He was a C-plus student, but still a dedicated athlete. He was the co-captain of the football team and was on the basketball team. He even held the freshman record for long jump, making it 22 feet 6.5 inches. He started dating another student, Sharon McNeil. Though he seemed to really fall for her, Sharon didn't feel the same. Eventually, the couple broke up, and Randy responded by breaking into her home on August 3rd, 1970, and trashing her bedroom. even taking a stuffed bull that he had given her as a present. For this, he was arrested and charged with vandalizing her property, but ended up being found not guilty at trial, as there was no physical evidence actually linking him to the crime. In addition to this incident, there were allegations that he was exposing himself again, but once again were not positively linked to him. This prompted Randy to move to Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. And while Sharon had stopped speaking with Randy following their breakup and his vandalism, it should be noted that he continued to call her and send her letters, culminating in a nude photo 10 years after this on Christmas of 1980. According to Sharon, she never responded to any of his calls and letters, and eventually had to get an unlisted number so that he would stop contacting her. Now, during the summers between school, he continued to go home and work for the next 2 summers at Georgia Pacific Plywood and Stud Mill in Toledo. At the same time, he began a new relationship, this time with Tracy Connors, an 8th grader, y'all. An 8th grader. Mostly this meant he drove her around, but one time, when his parents were away, he had her over and the two made out and had some rather heavy petting going on. She said no to sex, but this was still enough for Randy to climax, after which he simply just went to bed. Another time, he had Tracy call Sharon and try and talk with her. But after the summer, luckily, he went back to college, and the relationship sort of just faded away. In the spring of 1971, Randy registered at Portland State University. He worked part-time as a cook and a waiter at the Burger Chef restaurant in town. At this time, he also got into religion, becoming a member of the Fellowship of Portland State University Campus Crusade for Christ and the Fellowship of the Christian Athletes. While his image was clean at school, his real life certainly was not. He continued his voyeurism, exposing himself often. His first arrest for this occurred just across the bridge in Vancouver, Washington, on August 7, 1972. He was charged and convicted of indecent exposure, receiving a suspended sentence. His second arrest happened on June 22, 1973, in Portland, Oregon, for which he was charged with indecent exposure, attempting to elude, and resisting arrest. He was sentenced to 5 months and 25 days in jail and 1 year probation. But once again, he didn't actually serve any jail time. After the 1973 football season, Randy was drafted in the 17th round by the Green Bay Packers, signing his contract on February 20th, 1974. For this, he would receive a $16,000 for his first season, as well as room and board and traveling expenses during preseason and regular season training. In addition, other performance-based bonuses were added to the contract for his performance throughout the season, provided he made the cut of the 47-man traveling team. Then, on February 22nd, 1974, he was again arrested for public indecency, this time receiving 5 years probation. In addition, he was to go to mandatory counseling. Of course, neither of those happened either. Here's to the surprise. In the spring of 1974, he went to Scottsdale, Arizona, as part of the training camp, traveling to Green Bay for the summer and to see if he made the cut for the traveling team. He did not. Instead, he stayed in Green Bay and played for the farm team, the Manitowoc Chiefs, from September 1974 until December of that same year. While there, he worked for the Oshkosh Truck Corporation as a press brake operator in the manufacture of fire trucks. Still, after a season, the Green Bay Packers released Randy. Part of it may have been his propensity for dropping passes, but there was a rumor circulating around that there was somewhere between 10 to 20 known incidents of indecent exposure involving Randy during his time in Wisconsin. After this, Randy returned to Portland, where he got a job at an electronics firm and part-time bartending, living in an apartment with a friend, Tim, who graduated from PSU. Beginning in 1975, multiple women reported being attacked by a man at knife point in Dunaway Park. This man would expose himself, then force the women to perform fellatio on him. When he was finished, he would rob them of their purses before taking off. Due to the number of reports, an undercover officer was brought in, Annette. She walked in the park multiple times, and nothing, to the point that the police almost gave up. But on March 5th, 1975, Annette was walking in the park and just suddenly knew she was being followed. Randy put a knife to her throat and demanded money, and so she gave him $8 bills that were sequentially marked for tracking purposes. She signaled the other officers who waited at the perimeters of the park. Before Randy let her go, he fondled her breasts and then took off. At the edge of the park, he was immediately arrested, handing over the knife, which ended up being just a paring knife. They also confiscated a gun found on the search of him. For this, he was charged with first-degree robbery, entering a plea deal for second-degree robbery on April 29, 1975. All the assault charges on the women were dropped. Before being sentenced, he was sent to see a psychiatrist, and after a thorough examination reported, quote, "It would be my opinion that Mr. Woodfield's problem is so severe as to be a very serious threat to the community, and although treating him as an outpatient might actually present him with a greater opportunity to be treated, I think this would present too great a risk to the community. For the safety of the community, he needs to be in an institutional setting. However, chances of being successfully treated in such a setting are rather dim." End quote. With that, Randy was sentenced to 10 years at the Oregon State Penitentiary on June 10th. Randy, of course, served less than 4 of his sentence, being released on July 6, 1979. After that, he participated in his 10-year high school reunion, acting as if everything were perfectly normal. After the reunion, he returned to Portland, where he stayed with one of his sisters and worked at Tektronix. It wasn't long until he was back on his feet, but after that, he quit working at Tektronix and resumed bartending instead. The social scene and women were what he seemed to be after, making up for lost time while he was incarcerated. His little black book with over 255 names and numbers amassed rather quickly. Later he would say, quote, "I screwed up. I was in too much of a hurry, and I got herpes from one of them." End quote. Randy visited Tim Rossi, his friend and former roommate, in Tacoma on October 11, 1980. Tim complained about a recent breakup from longtime girlfriend Darcy Fix. Randy took the breakup as a personal slight to him, not just to Tim. And on November 27, 1980, Darcy and boyfriend Doug Altick were found in Darcy's apartment in Portland. The couple had been shot, execution style. When Tim found out, he asked detectives if Darcy had a chance to use her gun to protect herself. In response, they asked, "What gun?" Darcy's father confirmed that she had an old .32 caliber chrome revolver. Old enough, it didn't have to be registered. It was missing from the apartment when detectives searched. On January 18, 1981, a call came into 911 just before 10 p.m. from the Transamerica Title Building. A girl reported being shot by a man, that he had shot her friend as well, and she thought she might be dead. She managed to give details of the attacker before police arrived. Pretty amazing considering she was shot in the head. When police and paramedics arrived, they found 2 nude girls. 20-year-old Beth Wilmot was standing. She was the one who managed to make the call. Other than being nude, Beth had blackened eyes on the right side of her face and was swollen and bruised. Blood was coming out of a spot by her right ear, and paramedics realized it was an entrance wound and rushed her to Salem Memorial. The other girl, Sherry Hull, was comatose following 3 gunshots to the head. She too was rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, she was pronounced dead a short time later. She had 3 bullet wounds to the back of the head. On the ride to the hospital, Beth gave an account of what happened to Deputy Pappenfuss, who rode along with her. There, she reported that her attacker was a white man, slender build, maybe 25 years old, around 6 feet tall, and had a Band-Aid placed over his nose. At the hospital, doctors removed 2 bullets from Beth, one that had flattened against the back of the skull, and a second one that had entered the back of the head but couldn't penetrate the skull either. Instead, it followed a path to the right side of her head, stopping just in front of her ear. That one was removed and given to police to use as evidence. It ended up being a .32 caliber bullet. Beth later was able to tell deputies that the 2 girls were in the building cleaning it late that evening. They were finishing up when Beth realized there were several small smudges on the door, and so she went to grab a cleaner and told Sherry. Sherry emptied the garbage, and it was then that Randy made his move. Coming in was Sherry being held at gunpoint, forcing both girls into the lunchroom as it couldn't be seen from the door. He forced them to perform fellatio on him. At one point, he attempted to rape one of the girls, but couldn't, and so went back to forced fellatio until he finished. Beth believed that was because Sherry was freaking out and crying heavily. It ended up sending their attacker into a rage, but she was too afraid to tell her friend to be quiet. Once Randy was done with them, he had them lie flat on the floor, and he shot Sherry once, then Beth, then repeated the process. Beth reported that she pretended to be dead after the 3rd shot to Sherry. Her ears rung due to the noise, and she was afraid to move for fear he wasn't gone. So she stayed still for at least 5 minutes before getting up and calling the police. Detective Dave Komanek took the case, and on a personal note, Beth was originally from out of town, and Sherry was her lifeline to the area. With her gone, Dave and his wife, Gail, essentially brought her into the family and took care of her and let her know that there were still some people in Salem that cared for her. Anyway, Detective Komanek put out a flyer seeking information about the killer, including a description, a composite sketch, and a case number. I couldn't find out how far he sent this, but it seems like it was a rather wide net because he received over 100 calls along the I-5 corridor of unsolved cases of assault against women. At this time, the man committing these assaults was known as the I-5 Bandit. He continued to work alongside Detective Holloway. They put Beth under hypnosis to get a better description. And then, at her request, she went back to Transamerica Building with the detectives and revealed still more details. She said if they caught him, she'd know his face. As an announcement of Sherry's death reached the news, tips flooded in by the hundreds. But still, nothing led to anything of substance. On January 29th, a 20-year-old clerk was working in Winchell's donut shop in Grants Pass, and Randy came in and robbed the store of $70. Then he fondled her and a teenage customer present in the shop before taking off. An hour later, in Medford, he robbed Richard's Market. On February 3rd, Detective Komanek sent out a teletype request for information on similar crimes to the 7 western states. The next day, they got a call from Shasta County, California. Captain Jim Carter and Detective Gene Farley said they had a double murder down there, that it happened to occur on the same day as they received the teletype, and the weapon was believed to have been a .32 caliber gun. That day, Donna Eckerd, an RN at Mercy Hospital, wasn't feeling so well, so she went home partway through her shift. Oldest daughter, 14-year-old Janelle Jarvis, was there as well. Their stepdaughter to Steve Eckerd, a firefighter who happened to be away on a 24-hour shift. 12-year-old Kristen Jarvis stayed late at school to watch a basketball game. She called home around 6 p.m. and got permission from her mother to go to a friend's house after the game. Donna said it was fine as long as she came home by 9 p.m. Her mother also mentioned she would be going to Jake's Market to grab a few things. Kristen came home at 9 p.m. and called out to her mother and sister, but was met with silence. She walked into the master bedroom and found the two laying side by side. Donna was shot in the head twice and in a nightgown with her breast exposed, tape around her ankles and wrists. Janelle was nude and her whole face was bloodied. She had been beaten in the back of the head and then shot several times. The bullets matched those taken from Beth and Sherry. Autopsy later revealed that she had been orally sodomized and then post-mortem anally sodomized. Kristen called 911 immediately, and Steve found out it was his house that the call was coming from. Investigators found an uncashed check written out to Jake dated February 3rd. The only thing missing from the house was a .38 Special Model 60 Smith & Wesson with stainless steel 3-inch barrel and walnut grips. The serial number was given to the investigators. Later, they found out that also, early that same day, in Reading, Marie Sloan, a 46-year-old owner of Burger Express, was working with 18-year-old Leah Morris when a man came in. He fit the same description as everyone else was giving. Also, he forced Marie into the bathroom and taped her wrists and ankles. Then he forced the 18-year-old to get naked, fondling Marie's breasts while she did. He orally sodomized her and then attempted anal before returning to oral sodomy and ejaculating. Randy fastened his pants back on, and before he could do anything else, Marie's husband entered the store and attempted to gain entry to the bathroom. Randy shouted, "It's busy," before opening the door, brandishing his gun, and forcing the husband into the bathroom as well. Then Randy took flight. Marie's husband showing up likely saved both women's lives that day. On February 4th in Eureka, Jessie Clovis, a 21-year-old, was buying cigarettes at a liquor store when she went to start her car to leave. Randy opened the door and forced Jessie to move over, telling her that he had a gun, and he even showed it to her. He took off driving, forcing her to lay flat and fillet him as he drove. After driving out of the city, he forced her to take her clothes off and raped her. After he was finished, he taped up her wrists and then drove her back into town, parking in the parking lot. Then he took off. She managed to get the tape off her wrists, got clothes on, and then drove straight to the police department, informing them of her attack and giving a pretty solid description of Randy. Investigators in California also informed detectives in Oregon that a suspect matching the description that Beth provided, including the Band-Aid on the nose, was wanted for a rape, kidnap, and sodomy case in Reading, again on the 3rd, in Eureka on the 4th, and a motel robbery on the 4th in Ashland. Back in Oregon, a Winchell Donuts robbery took place in Grants Pass on January 29th, and a grocery store robbery in Medford later that day. More reports from January 28th through February 4th came along with more reports from Eugene up to Seattle, Washington. In total, they had 3 incidents of murder and many more rapes along the I-5 corridor, and his new nickname appeared, the I-5 Killer. On February 9th, Randy robbed a fabric store in Corvallis at 8 p.m. The 38-year-old clerk and a female customer were forced into the back room where their hands, ankles, and mouths were taped shut. Randy masturbated against the clerk's face as he fondled her. Then 10 miles east at an Albany laundromat, Randy bound and sodomized 2 more women. On February 12th, Randy robbed the Sassy Dress Shop in Vancouver, Washington, binding an elderly clerk and robbing them of $50. An hour later, in Olympia, Washington, he stopped at a drive-in restaurant, attacking 2 teenagers. He forced them into a freezer and sexually abused them before stealing all the money in the cash register. By 10 p.m., he was in Bellevue, where he stopped at a Dairy Queen and grabbed the store's cash, locked the mail in a freezer, and attacked the young woman. All the sketches created as a result of these victims he left alive matched. And of course, they were all Randy. On February 14th, 18-year-old Julie Wrights was killed. She was found dead, nude on the stairs of her own home. Julie had been one of Randy's admirers years prior. They had a falling out when she found out that he was with another woman, finding them both in bed. She was found by her mother as she returned home on February 15th. At first, her mother thought she had fallen or fainted, but after seeing blood, called the ambulance. Once it was determined Julie had been shot, police were called. The bullet in this case was from a .38 Special. There was semen on her bed, and her mother insisted she hadn't been sexually active for a few months, so that was collected as evidence. On February 18th, Randy attacked a female attendant at a 7-Eleven on Coburg Road in Eugene. She was left bound with surgical tape. A man walked in and heard her as she made noises trying to free herself. Once freed, she went straight to the police to relay her attack. 3 days later, Randy walked into a Taco Time on River Road, still in Eugene, and 2 teenagers had been working. They were both nervous because of recent news reports on this I-5 killer. As Randy came in, he had his hands in his pockets, and it set 17-year-old Connie Soldano, her creep raider, off. She bolted out the back, hearing him shout, "Stop!" She half turned and saw a gun, but she did not stop. She ran to the Dairy Queen next door and called the police immediately. Meanwhile, Terry Brady was left in the shop, and Randy told her to squat down on the floor and not move. She did, and Randy ran out the shop, throwing out surgical tape in the parking lot as he ran. Connie saved both their lives that night. On February 25th, he stalked a small restaurant in Corvallis. 2 teenagers were working, and he waited until 18-year-old Jill Martin walked around the back to the restrooms. He forced his way in and forced oral sodomy. She spit out his semen and he reportedly laughed, and then he bound her hands and feet and took off. Jill managed to get her way to the restaurant door and kicked at it until her friend inside heard her and let her in. The semen added to the mounds of evidence police were already collecting against Randy. Detectives who were working hard to find something, anything, to find out who this man was. They went back to the case of Julie, whose mother said she wouldn't have let someone in the house she didn't know, and there was no forced entry. They spoke with her friends, asking if there was anyone that might have been slightly important, but was forgotten. One of the friends remembered a Randy Woodfield that had worked at Fawcett Tavern, that they had dated once or twice, but he came on too strong and was much older than Julie, and so Julie said they should just be friends. He drove a gold-colored Volkswagen Bug. Another friend remembered a time when Randy spent the night and Julie and she were in the same bed, but that he crawled in and fondled Julie a bit before leaving. A third person corroborated seeing Randy in Beaverton on Valentine's Day, and with that, Randy was suddenly on police radar. Next, detective spoke with a former colleague of Randy's from the Fawcett who painted the man as one who likes young girls and is jealous and angry when rejected. On February 28th, Judy Pullman, Randy's parole officer, spoke with detectives. She mentioned his multiple crimes along with being questioned about several homicides in the area. That he had recently requested to be transferred to Eugene, where he had moved already. Detectives then got in touch with his new parole officer, Tony Meyer, who stated that he was due in for a check on March 3rd. So they waited. When he missed it, police went to the place he rented, and eventually, after knocking for an extremely long time, Randy finally answered. He came to the police station to answer questions. He reported not knowing Julie until he saw her picture, then stated he hung out with her a few times, that he knew her from the Fawcett. That was really about it. At first he said yes to a polygraph as well as hair and blood samples, but eventually he recanted on all of it. After hours of talking, he agreed to have his house and car searched. Other than a receipt for a gun and an old gun cleaning kit, not much evidence was noted. They did take sheets with hairs on them for analysis. The police went back to his house, and while Randy hadn't returned, his housemate, Arden Bates, and her young son, Mickey, were home. She answered the questions police asked and mentioned that Randy liked to use the phone a lot, often to make long-distance calls. She provided a phone bill, and the police didn't note any calls to Julie, but they did find a call from Shasta, California, to Arden on February 3rd, the same day as the murders. The police informed Arden it would be best if she and her son left for a few days, at which Arden asked if Randy was the I-5 killer. The police, of course, couldn't say anything at the time, as it was an open investigation. Detective Komanek and Holloway were called and asked to come down to Eugene. There, they continued to ask Arden questions, and she dutifully gave them timelines of when he was gone and where he was, according to him. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and moreover, the police received his prison records. In it was his blood type. He was type B, matching in all of the cases where semen was present. In the meantime, police watched Randy after he came home, but they didn't arrest him at this time. Now here, there's a lot of sources that say that multiple jurisdictions of the case caused controversy on who would arrest him and get the glory of stopping this serial killer. All parties ended up staying hands-off for days as a result of this. Until Detective Komanek had enough, he knocked on the door and spoke with Randy. During a cursory glance of the house, he noted that the fireplace had been used. Randy had been burning things. Unfortunately, it is highly likely that a lot of that was evidence. After a brief conversation, Randy was arrested for violating his parole when he failed to return to Portland as required by his parole officer. In the interrogation room, the detectives first talked about sports and other similar things, like where Randy worked, to get him talking. Then he slid the request as they were talking about his sexual activity to know if he'd ever contracted any STDs. Randy said that he got herpes shortly after getting out of prison. What Randy didn't know was that several of his victims unfortunately did too, after being attacked by him. Then they spoke about his travels and where he had been, leaning into the questions about his times in California and going up to Portland. While Randy sat in jail in Eugene, police worked hard. They sent photos of Randy to Portland, but Beth had a hard time picking any out. While she did put her finger on his photograph, she refused to confirm 100% it was him, as she had some doubts. But she agreed to travel to Eugene for a lineup. Other women who suffered attacks were also located and requested they come to Eugene if they were up to it. On March 5th, a warrant was signed for the search of Randy's house, and for 3 days it was searched. Outfits matching the description from women who suffered at the hands of Randy were pulled out and logged. A pubic hair was found and microscopically examined. It matched the one found in the Transamerica building. A lone .32 caliber bullet was found in the pouch of his racquetball bag in his room. The Remington Peters .32 Colt long bullet was rare and matched the same type of bullet used in the shootings of Beth Wilmot, Sherry Hull, Janelle Jarvis, and Donna Eckerd. In addition, Senior Trooper Richard Davis matched the phone numbers to women that Randy had been calling. While in jail, Randy's father came to visit him, and Randy accidentally told him that he was with Julie the night of Valentine's before the murder. That's why he was in jail, though detectives hadn't told him anything about it. A laydown was sent out, a photograph with him and similar-looking people, in which he was booked in as number 3. A woman in Bothell, Washington, who had run into the I-5 bandit, picked him out immediately. Then on March 8th, the lineup was ready, and more than a dozen people were brought in, all victims of Randy. They changed his number in the lineup so it wasn't the same as the laydown. He was picked out by many of his victims. Often they cited his eyes and his voice, including a 10-year-old girl who stated that his voice, eyes, build were the same, though his hair was different, but she was well aware it could be cut. A few people got the wrong person, but those were often those who had shorter interactions and not physically assaulted by him. Beth was the last to be brought in, and she identified him as the killer and attacker of her and Sherry. Detectives worked through the night and put out all information together, And with that, on Monday, after the lineup, Randy was arrested for the murder of Sherry Hull and the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot, He was transported up to Salem, where he would stay in jail until trial. Detectives continued to try and put pieces together. They wanted to get him for all of his crimes. One friend, Dixie Pelliter, was interviewed by Detective Loper. She admitted to buying him a gun, a .32 caliber. She also reported that Randy admitted to robbing a Baskin-Robbins in Washington, along with the mention that he wore a fake beard and a Band-Aid over his nose, stating that the nose made people more identifiable. The gun that was taken during the California murder was recovered and determined that the bullets were the ones that were recovered from Julie Wright's. While this was circumstantial, it lends more credence that Randy was the killer in both cases. On March 16, 1981, the official indictment of Randy on murder and attempted murder came down from Marion County grand jury to be held without bail. Charlie Burt was assigned as his defense attorney, and as expected, Randy pleaded not guilty on all charges. On March 24th, he pleaded not guilty to charges added from Albany, not guilty to 2 counts of sodomy, 2 counts of attempted kidnapping, and 1 count of being an ex-convict in possession of a firearm. Bothell, Washington, added 1 count of robbery for the Baskin-Robbins robbery. Bellevue, Washington, brought in sexual assault at Dairy Queen on February 12th. On April 1st, Randy pleaded not guilty to 7 felony charges in Benton County, Oregon. It included 2 counts of sodomy, 1 count of burglary from an attack on Mary Sue and Megan Green, an 8 and 10-year-old respectively, along with robbery and sexual abuse from the fabric store in Corvallis, and sodomy and kidnapping from the fast food restaurant in Corvallis as well. On May 28th, the pretrial hearing for the murder of Sherry and attempted murder of Beth began, in which Beth identified her attacker. The official trial began on June 9, 1981, in Salem with jury selection. Opening statements began on June 11th. The trial was a lot of back and forth. Randy's lawyer took the stance that it was circumstantial. He even did the thing that we all hate, or should fucking hate because it's disgusting. Charlie Burt asked if Beth was sexually active. What the fuck this has to do with anything, nobody will ever know. Irrelevant as it was, Van Dyke with the prosecution objected, but it was sustained. Still, shame on Burt. The victim shouldn't be dragged like that ever. Like ever. It was a tactic to fluster her, and it sounds like it failed, thankfully. After closing arguments, the jury went to discuss. 3.5 hours later, in a unanimous decision, Randy was found guilty of the murder and attempted murder, along with 2 counts of sodomy. It wasn't until October 12th that he was sentenced. Judge Brown had something to say. First, he sentenced Randy to life for the murder of Sherry, and an indeterminate amount not to exceed 30 years for the attempted murder, as well as each counts of sodomy. These charges were run consecutively. Quote, I have made the sentences consecutive because the court has found that you are a menace to society, and the court has the duty to protect the public by the use of consecutive sentences in order to protect the public from further criminal conduct by you. This court is making the strongest possible recommendation to the Oregon State Board of Parole and Probation that you serve a minimum of 50 years before you are considered eligible for release. If the death penalty in Oregon had not been declared unconstitutional, I would have no hesitancy whatsoever to say, Mr. Woodfield, you are going to die. End quote. He sentenced Randy to life plus 90 years. He ended by saying, quote, if you are released earlier, it will not be because the court has failed its duty, end quote. And yes, at this time, Oregon had a brief period where they did not have the death penalty, but it was quickly reinstated by voters. On November 2nd, 1981, Corvallis saw their crimes heard in court, led by Judge Knight. Another jury selection and the trial was on. Randy had a new attorney, Jim Hilborn, and he saw fit to bring in a new alibi for Randy as well. But, much the same as the first trial, the woman attacked by Randy was stronger than anything the defense could muster, And again, after only 3 hours, he was found guilty of sodomy and being an ex-convict in possession of a weapon. On December 18, 1981, Judge Knight sentenced him to another 35 years to be run consecutively to the first 4. In July of 1982, Lynn County added 2 more charges of sodomy. After adding up their time in total, he was sentenced to life plus 165 years. At this time, he remains at Oregon State Penitentiary, where his earliest release date simply says, life. And as a side note, many of the guys within Oregon State Penitentiary don't register Randy much this day. They know that he's a big guy and that he pushes the laundry cart around from unit to unit. But that's about it. So there's that. And it sounds like he will not be getting out until he leaves with a toe tag. As always, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.